The morning after, the dawn came cold and gray, slipping through the curtains of Dr. Harrison's guest room like an unwelcome visitor. James Mackenzie had not slept. He'd held Eleanor through the dark hours, feeling her breathing gradually slow and deepen as exhaustion finally claimed her. But his own mind refused rest. Every creak of the house settling, every distant sound from the street below, sent his hand reaching for the rifle propped against the bedside table. Now, with pale light filling the room, he eased himself carefully from the bed. Eleanor stirred but didn't wake. James dressed quietly, his shoulder protesting the movement. The bullet wound Blackwood's man had given him months ago had healed, but cold mornings still made it ache. He paused at the door, looking back at his wife's sleeping form. In the gray dawn light, Eleanor looked older than her 38 years, lines of worry etched deep around her eyes even in sleep. Downstairs, he found Sarah already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She didn't look up when he entered. "Couldn't sleep either?" James asked, keeping his voice low. Sarah shook her head. Her rifle leaned against the wall beside her chair, within easy reach. The gunpowder stains on her fingers had darkened overnight, and James noticed her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cup to her lips. "I keep seeing it," she said quietly. His face when I pulled the trigger, the way he looked, surprised, like he didn't think I'd really do it. James pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Cross was a professional killer, Sarah. If you hadn't shot him, he would have killed your mother, then the rest of us." "I know." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "That's what makes it easier. And that's what scares me, Papa, that it's getting easier." Before James could respond, Mrs. Zach Brennan bustled into the kitchen, her practical energy filling the space. "You two are up early, though I suppose none of us got much sleep." She moved to the stove, stoking the fire. "I'll make a proper breakfast. You'll need your strength for the depositions this afternoon." The depositions. James had almost forgotten. At 2:00, they were expected at the courthouse to give additional testimony about Silas Pemberton's death and the administrative challenge to their homestead claim. Another round of reliving the nightmare, putting it into official words while lawyers took notes and judges weighed credibility. "Is Thomas still asleep?" James asked. Mrs. Brennan nodded. "The poor boy. He finally dropped off around 3. Dr. Harrison checked on him, said sometimes the body just shuts down when it can't take any more." James thought about his son's face last night, watching his sister kill a man, 11 years old, and already carrying memories that would haunt him for life. What kind of father brings his family to this? The question had been circling James's mind all night, wearing a groove like wagon wheels on a well-traveled road. 3 years ago, they'd left Ontario full of hope and dreams. Free land, fresh starts, opportunity. The Dominion Lands Act had promised 160 acres for the price of 3 years' work. It hadn't mentioned the cost in blood and fear. "I should check the perimeter," Sarah said, standing abruptly. She took her rifle without thinking, the movement automatic now. "Sergeant Morrison has men posted," James reminded her. 2 constables out front, 2 in back." "I know, but I need to see for myself." James understood. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford, even with the mounted police standing guard. Sarah slipped out the back door, and James watched through the window as she made a circuit of Dr. Harrison's yard, checking sight lines and approaches with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to think like the men hunting her. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a borrowed robe. "Is she all right?" "No," James said honestly. "None of us are." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Together they watched their daughter, 19 years old but moving like a soldier, scanning for threats in the morning light. "Thomas Garrett wants to meet with us before the depositions," Eleanor said quietly. Daniel brought word from Sergeant Morrison. "They have more questions about the consortium's operations." James nodded. The investigator who'd arrived last night with 8 months of evidence had transformed their situation from isolated victims to key witnesses in a territorial case. But witnesses could be eliminated, and the consortium had already proven they were willing to kill. "Jack Delaney is still out there," James said, "wounded but alive. And Morrison said there might be 2 or 3 more we didn't account for." "I know." Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. But running won't change that. If we leave Alberta, they'll just follow us, or they'll wait until we think we're safe and come for us then. At least here we have allies. We have the law on our side. Do we? The bitterness in James's voice surprised him. The consortium has lawyers and money and newspapers. They killed Blackburn in Calgary and made it look natural. They can probably do the same to us. James. Eleanor turned him to face her. Last night, you told Thomas that brave men stay even when they're scared. Were those just words? The question hit like a physical blow. James thought of his son's face, asking if they were going to die. Of his own answer, I don't know, but we're going to keep fighting. No, he said quietly. They weren't just words. Then we stay. We give our depositions. We help Garrett build his case, and we trust that there are still enough honest men in Regina who won't let Toronto money buy justice. James wanted to believe her, but he'd seen too much corruption, too many officials who looked the other way when powerful men wanted something. Still, what choice did they have? Run forever? Live in fear? Always looking over their shoulders? Daniel came in through the front door, stamping frost from his boots. Sergeant Morrison wants everyone gathered in the parlor at 10 o'clock. Garrett has new information. What kind of information? James asked. Daniel's face was grim. He wouldn't say, but Morrison looked worried. The household assembled slowly as morning wore on. Thomas woke pale and quiet, eating his breakfast mechanically, while Eleanor kept a protective hand on his shoulder. Dr. Harrison emerged from his study where he'd been catching a few hours' sleep in his chair. Edmund Whitmore arrived at 9:45, looking even more exhausted than the night before. I've been reviewing the consortium's legal filings, the elderly lawyer said, accepting coffee from Mrs. Brennan. They're already filing motions to dismiss in Regina, claiming Hartwell acted alone, that they were deceived by a rogue lawyer. Will it work? Eleanor asked. It might. If Garrett can't prove direct connection between the consortium leadership and the murders, they'll walk away clean. Rich men always do. At precisely 10 o'clock, Sergeant Morrison arrived with Thomas Garrett. The investigator looked like he'd been up all night. His lean face drawn and his eyes red-rimmed. But there was an energy about him, a coiled tension that suggested important news. Thank you all for gathering, Garrett said, accepting a chair in Dr. Harrison's parlor. I know you're exhausted, and I apologize for adding to your burden, but there have been developments overnight that change our situation. James felt Eleanor's hand find his again. Sarah stood by the window, rifle within reach, watching the street. Jack Delaney was found dead an hour ago, Garrett said bluntly. In an alley behind the railroad hotel, single bullet to the back of the head, execution style. The words hung in the air. James tried to process them. Delaney dead? But he'd escaped last night, wounded but alive. Who had killed him? The consortium, Sarah said from the window, her voice flat. They're cleaning up loose ends. Garrett nodded slowly. That's my assessment. Delaney was a liability, wounded, possibly captured, able to testify against them. They eliminated him before he could talk. Then we're next, Daniel said quietly. Possibly, but I don't think so. Garrett leaned forward, his intensity filling the room. Killing you now would be too obvious. The territorial prosecutor is already building a case. Your deaths would only strengthen it, make martyrs of you. The consortium is smarter than that. So what will they do? James asked. They'll try to discredit you, claim you're opportunists, liars trying to profit from tragedy. They'll use their newspapers to shape public opinion, their lawyers to tie up the case in procedural delays. They'll make your testimony worthless without ever touching you. Eleanor's voice was steady. How do we fight that? By being absolutely truthful, by documenting everything, by making your story so compelling, so detailed, that no amount of legal maneuvering can dismiss it. Garrett pulled papers from his case. That's why your depositions this afternoon are crucial. The prosecutor needs every detail about the administrative challenge, about Pemberton's death, about how the consortium tried to steal your land through legal manipulation. Pemberton, Whitmore said thoughtfully. His death was ruled suicide, but the confession letter was clearly forged. If we can prove that, we can, Garrett interrupted. I have a handwriting expert from Calgary examining the letter now, but I need your testimony to establish why the consortium wanted him dead, what he knew that made him dangerous. James thought about Silas Pemberton, the land office clerk who'd filed the fraudulent challenge to their homestead claim. He'd been found dead with a convenient confession that absolved the consortium while eliminating a witness. The consortium's pattern was becoming clear. Use people, then dispose of them when they became liabilities. "There's something else," Morrison said, speaking for the first time. "We found evidence in Delaney's room at the hotel. Letters, payment receipts, instructions. He kept records." "Professional killers usually don't," Garrett said. But Delaney was careful. He documented everything, probably as insurance against his employers. Those records connect directly to Martin Hartwell and through him to the consortium leadership. For the first time since the previous night's violence, James felt something like hope stirring. "You can prove the connection?" "With your testimony, yes. With the documents from Delaney's room, the evidence from Blackburn's investigation that you preserved, and the testimony from the families in other territories, we can build a case that even Toronto money can't buy its way out of." "How long?" Sarah asked from the window. "How long until the trial?" Garrett's face fell slightly. "Months. Possibly a year or more. The consortium will use every delay tactic their lawyers can devise. And during that time, we're targets," James finished. "Even if they don't kill us, they'll make our lives hell. Legal harassment, economic pressure, social isolation." "Yes," Garrett said honestly, "I won't lie to you about that, but you have something they don't. You have the truth, and you have allies. The territorial prosecutor is committed to this case. The mounted police are providing protection. And I'll be here, building the evidence, until we see this through." Eleanor spoke up. "And the mine? Our homestead? What happens to those while we're fighting this legal battle?" "The administrative challenge has been withdrawn," Whitmore reminded them. "The land is legally yours. As for the mine, I'd recommend leaving it untouched until after the trial. Any attempt to extract ore now would just give the consortium another angle to attack you." "So we own a fortune we can't use," James said bitterly. "While we live on charity and wait for justice that might never come." "James," Eleanor said quietly, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry. I know we're lucky to be alive. I know we have more than most. But last night, I watched my daughter kill a man. I saw my son's eyes after he witnessed it. And now we're being told to wait, to trust the system, while the men who've tried to murder us sit in Toronto drawing rooms planning their legal strategy." The room fell silent. Mrs. Brennan set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. Thomas, who'd been sitting quietly beside his mother, looked up at his father with those two old eyes. "Papa," the boy said softly, "are you giving up?" The question pierced James like a blade. He looked at his son, 11 years old, traumatized, exhausted, but still looking to his father for strength. "No," James said, his voice rough. "No, son, I'm not giving up. I'm just tired." "We're all tired," Sarah said from the window. She turned to face the room, and James saw something in her face that was both his daughter and a stranger. "But Garrett's right. We can't run. We can't hide. The only way through this is to fight it on their terms. With the law, with testimony, with truth. Even if it takes years." "Sarah's right," Daniel added, "and you're not alone in this. My family stands with you. The Reeds, the Schmidts, the Hoffmans, everyone who helped defend your homestead. We're all witnesses. They can't silence all of us." Garrett nodded. "That's exactly right. The consortium's power comes from operating in darkness, from isolated victims who can be picked off one by one. But you've brought everything into the light. You've built a community of allies. That's your greatest protection." James looked around the room, at his exhausted family, at the allies who'd risked their lives, at the investigators and lawyers who'd committed themselves to this fight. They were right. Running would solve nothing. The consortium would just find other victims, other families with valuable land and no protection. "All right," he said finally. "We give the depositions. We help build the case. We see this through." He looked at Garrett. "But I want your word that if it becomes clear the consortium is going to win, if the law fails us, you'll help us disappear. Get my family somewhere safe." Garrett met his eyes steadily. "You have my word, but I don't think it will come to that. The consortium has made mistakes. They've left evidence. They've killed people in ways that can be proven. We can beat them." "I hope you're right," Eleanor said softly. The meeting broke up shortly after, with Morrison returning to his duties and Garrett departing to continue his investigation. The family had a few hours before the 2 o'clock depositions, time to rest and prepare for another ordeal of reliving their nightmare in official language. James found himself alone in Dr. Harrison's study, staring at the medical books lining the shelves without really seeing them. 3 years ago, he'd been a quarryman in Ontario, breaking stone for railroad beds and dreaming of something better. Now he was a homesteader fighting for his life against men he'd never met, men who viewed him as an obstacle to be removed. How had it come to this? Papa? He turned to find Sarah in the doorway. She'd left her rifle in the parlor, he noticed. A small thing, but significant. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what I said earlier, about it getting easier. I shouldn't burden you with that. Sarah, you're my daughter. Your burdens are mine. He gestured to a chair, and she sat. And you were right to say it. It should scare you that killing is getting easier. That's your conscience talking, your humanity. Don't lose that. But how do I keep it? Her voice broke slightly. When I pulled that trigger last night, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just did it. And afterward, all I felt was relief that Mama was safe. Shouldn't I feel something else? Guilt? Horror? You feel what you need to feel to survive, James said. The guilt and horror will come later when you're safe, when you have time to process it. Right now, your mind is protecting you, letting you function. That's not wrong, Sarah. That's human. But what if later never comes? What if this is just how we live now, always watching, always ready to kill? James had no answer for that. It was the same fear that had kept him awake all night, the same question Eleanor had voiced in the darkness. Had they traded quick death for slow death? Had they become the very thing they'd fled Ontario to escape? People ground down by hardship until nothing was left but survival? I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know this. You saved your mother's life last night. You protected your family. Whatever else happens, whatever it costs you, that matters. That's worth something. Sarah nodded slowly, but James could see she wasn't convinced. How could she be? She was 19 years old, should have been thinking about teaching school and courting and building a life. Instead, she was thinking about sightlines and killing zones and how to protect her family from professional assassins. The clock in the study ticked toward noon. In 2 hours, they would give their depositions. They would relive Pemberton's death, describe the consortium's legal manipulations, build the case that Garrett needed. And then they would wait. For weeks, months, possibly years, while lawyers argued and judges deliberated, and the consortium used every resource at their disposal to escape justice. James thought about the mine, the silver deposit that had brought all this death and fear. It sat on their land, worth a fortune they couldn't touch. Sometimes he wished they'd never found it, never discovered the letters that revealed Blackwood's crimes. They could have lost the homestead to foreclosure, moved on, started over somewhere else. But then the consortium would have taken the land. They would have gotten away with murder. And somewhere else, another family would have found valuable minerals on their claim, and the cycle would have started again. No. Eleanor was right. They had to see this through. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. For the Hendersons who'd fled in fear. For the families in Manitoba and Saskatchewan that Garrett had mentioned. For every homesteader who'd ever faced powerful men trying to steal what they'd worked for. At 1:45, the family gathered in the front hall. They were dressed in their best clothes, cleaned and mended, but showing the wear of frontier life. James wore the suit he'd been married in, Eleanor a dress she'd brought from Ontario and rarely had occasion to wear. Sarah had braided her hair and put on a simple gray dress that made her look older than her years. Thomas wore clothes borrowed from Dr. Harrison's nephew, slightly too large but respectable. They looked, James thought, like what they were, frontier people trying to maintain dignity in the face of forces beyond their control. Ready? Eleanor asked, taking his arm. As I'll ever be, James replied. They walked to the courthouse in a group, James and Eleanor, Sarah and Daniel, Thomas between them. Sergeant Morrison and 2 constables accompanied them, a visible show of protection. People on the street stopped to watch them pass, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, a few with hostility. The Mackenzies had become famous in Medicine Hat, their story spreading through the territory. That fame was protection of a sort, but it also made them targets. The courthouse was a modest building, wood frame with a false front to make it look more impressive. Inside, the air smelled of paper and wood smoke. Thomas Garrett waited for them in a side room, along with a court clerk and a stenographer. "Thank you for coming," Garrett said. "I know this is difficult, but your testimony today could be the key to everything." James nodded. "Let's get started." For the next 3 hours, they told their story again. James described the administrative challenge that had appeared without warning, the suspicious timing that coincided with the consortium's other attacks. Eleanor detailed Pemberton's nervous behavior, the way he'd avoided eye contact when filing the fraudulent paperwork. Sarah explained how the challenge had been designed to prevent them from accessing their ore while the consortium prepared their final assault. The stenographer's pen scratched across paper, recording every word. The clerk asked clarifying questions, establishing timelines and connections. And through it all, Garrett watched with intense focus, occasionally interjecting to draw out details that strengthened the case. When they finally finished, the winter sun was setting, painting the courthouse windows gold. James felt hollowed out, drained by the ordeal of reliving those events in clinical detail. But Garrett looked satisfied. "This is exactly what we needed," the investigator said. "Your testimony establishes motive and pattern. Combined with the physical evidence and Delaney's records, we have a strong case." "Strong enough to convict?" Eleanor asked. "Strong enough to try," Garrett replied carefully. "The rest depends on judges and juries, on whether the system works the way it's supposed to." They walked back to Dr. Harrison's house in the twilight, exhausted but relieved to have the depositions behind them. Mrs. Brennan had supper waiting, roast chicken and potatoes, simple frontier fare that tasted like a feast after the day's ordeal. As they ate, James found himself watching his family. Thomas, still pale but eating steadily. Eleanor, tired but unbowed. Sarah, quiet and distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. They had survived another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears. But tonight, they were together and safe. After supper, James stepped out onto Dr. Harrison's back porch. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant in the darkness. Somewhere out there, the consortium's leaders were plotting their next move. Lawyers were drafting motions. Newspapers were being written to shape public opinion. But here, in this moment, James Mackenzie stood under the prairie stars and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Fragile, uncertain hope, but hope nonetheless. They had told their story. They had allies. They had the law on their side, however imperfect that law might be. The door opened behind him. Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. "You should come inside," she said. "It's freezing." "In a minute," he turned to her. "Eleanor, I want you to know, whatever happens, whatever this costs us, I'm glad we fought. I'm glad we didn't run." She moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "So am I. Though I reserve the right to regret that sentiment when we're old and gray and still dealing with lawyers." James smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face. When was the last time he'd smiled? "Deal." They stood together in the cold night, looking out at the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The consortium would continue their legal warfare. The families would continue to live under threat. But tonight they had survived. They had told their truth. And sometimes on the frontier, that had to be enough. Inside, Thomas was asking Daniel about the stars, his child's curiosity momentarily overcoming his trauma. Sarah was helping Mrs. Brennan with the dishes, her movements automatic but steady. Dr. Harrison was reading by the fire, his presence a quiet reassurance. Life continued. Not normal life, not the peaceful existence they dreamed of when they came west, but life nonetheless. Survival with purpose, struggle with meaning. James Mackenzie took his wife's hand and led her back inside into the warmth and light. The war wasn't over, but for tonight they had won a small victory. The victory of still standing, still fighting, still believing that truth mattered. On the frontier, sometimes that had to be enough.
Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures. Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures.